Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. Today we're going to focus upon a wide range of issues from peace and security to nuclear disarmament to climate change to migration and perhaps two or three more. My guest is an expert on all of these. Dr. Bob Zuber is the Director of Global Action to Prevent War and Armed Conflict. Dr. Zuber, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thanks, Bill. It's good to be with you.
Appreciate you coming back again. Thank you. We haven't done this for a few years, and there's so much going on internationally that it impacts us locally. We could do a show every week, probably. Let's talk a little bit before we get into the issues. Talk about the Global Action to Prevent War and Armed Conflict. That's your non-governmental organization. What is it? When was it formed? Why was it formed?
Thanks. Well, actually, we're starting our 20th year this year, which is quite remarkable for a tiny little nonprofit as we are. And we've gone through various iterations from outlining a security framework for the 21st century to more human security concerns that we engage at the moment. We have three priorities, one of which is interrogating the UN system from one end to the other. There's very little about the UN now that doesn't deal with security in some way, how people's access to food and health care, people's access to education, gender equality, persons with disabilities and their rights, as we were talking about a moment ago. All of these have peace and security implications, and we try to cover them and blend them and make insights available to diplomats and others. The second thing is that we try to do a lot of mentoring with a diverse array of young people. It's really their turn now. I've had my turn. I've been on the ride. I've punched my ticket, and it's time, ready or not, it's time for other people to punch their ticket, and to make sure that they represent the diversity of the human condition, and that they don't all look like you and me, and speak like you and me, and we take that very seriously. And then the final thing is that we'll segue into questions later. We make a priority of helping nonprofits in different parts of the world get a foothold here at the UN. It's not easy. It can be enormously complicating and frustrating. And so through social media, through direct engagement with people in diverse settings, we help them find a place here. And the more people from diverse backgrounds that have a place here, I think the better this place functions. Mm-hmm.
And our viewers can go to your website, globalactionpd.org.
PW.
PW, I'm
yes,
sorry,
no,
couldn't read it.
PW.org. I don't know where PD gets you, but PW will get you.
PW do it, okay. globalactionpw.org, right. Very good. We were talking about nuclear weapons, and there's so many different aspects of nuclear weapons. One that comes to mind immediately is that Russia and the United States are both talking about renovating, modernizing, whatever, their very aging stockpile of nuclear weapons. And just the fact that they're aging is dangerous, the fact that they're deteriorating. Is this an opportunity for us to change the culture of how we look upon nuclear weapons? Is this a good time to, instead of modernizing, spending trillions of dollars is what it would cost, to start thinking about downsizing, to eliminate nuclear weapons? Because it's been proven well, it hadn't been proven, but the scientific studies say that no country needs more than probably 300 nuclear weapons today, given the firepower that each contains. How do you view that?
Well, first of all, there are people around here who are better suited to this question than I am, obviously. I mean, we would obviously advocate for a world where 300 was excessive, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think we can do better than that, and there are movements afoot to do better than that. But part of the nuclear dilemma at the moment is similar to dilemmas in other existential threats around oceans and around climate, around migration. We'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. Is the failure of governments to abide by agreements and the willingness of governments to walk away from agreements rather than fix them. You know, for people who are not involved in this setting, this is very, very difficult for them to understand, because the worlds in which they live in, they have to fix things. They can't just toss them when they become inconvenient, and we don't advocate that they do, and we don't advocate that governments do as well. But you look at you look at the INF treaty process, you look at the Iranian Nuclear Agreement, which was ratified by a unanimous Security Council resolution, and now. One government in particular, but others as well, are kind of, well, you know, maybe this isn't in our best interest. That we have sovereign problems with some of this, And I think that it's important in all of these areas, but certainly in the nuclear area, and certainly given the fact that the IAEA is extremely competent and does wonderful monitoring and has verified Iran's compliance with this particular agreement over and over and over again, that we call governments to account when they feel they have the right to walk away from agreements that are not perfect but are beneficial to the global polity.
Right. You've referenced the Iranian nuclear deal, the one that was cracked in 2015, I believe in June or July of 2015. And the only goal of that agreement was to keep Iran from developing a nuclear weapon, which was no small goal. That was a major, major operation. The 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, Germany, the UN system, the EU, the European Union, agreed to this. The Iranians agreed to it. It was an agreement that looked like it was holding, you mentioned the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency. They have some of the best nuclear inspectors in the world, and they were monitoring it. And here, the United States pulled out unilaterally. What is this going to do to destabilize that area of the world if that agreement falls apart? Luckily, the other members of the P4 and Germany have kept it. They're continued on. But what will that do to that area, and how will it threaten Israel, as well as the rest of the countries in that area?
Well, I think it's part of a package, that the pullout is part of a package that at some level calls the Security Council itself into question, because it's not just a matter of pulling out of the agreement. It's about the reimposition of unilateral sanctions outside of a Security Council framework. It's about decisions to pull troops out of areas of the Middle East without, I agree with the decision to pull them, but without consulting partners, that there's no attempt to kind of rationalize these decisions and rationalize them within a multilateral framework. And that's the problem that we have with it, right? It's one can debate the merits of a particular decision one way or the other, but when you have agreements in place and you pull out of them unilaterally without consultation, and then reinforce the initial decision with other provocative decisions on top of it, it's very troubling.
Well, and the word now around the world is the United States cannot be trusted. The United States cannot be trusted because they agree to certain agreements and then they change their mind a month later or 6 months later, or if a new administration comes in.
Yeah, and again, I don't mean to overly psychologize these things, but I tend to. In our personal lives, if somebody agrees to something and then unilaterally decides to leave an agreement without a conversation, without any kind of compensation or concern about what their pullout means for the rest of the stakeholders who have a stake, this would be very, very troubling for most people, and it's troubling when governments do it as well.
Mm-hmm. One other agreement that, here we go again, the United States pulled out of this one, the Paris Climate Change Agreement, which was adopted in 2015 in Paris in December of 2015. And again, it wasn't perfect, but it was voluntary. All the countries, 193 countries that came together, really about 195, I think, that were involved in hammering out this agreement, decided that it was the best they could do, and they realized that it's imperative to try to keep the global temperatures at least try to get as close to 1.5 Celsius as possible, and that's where they were moving in that direction. And now today we see that the second largest polluter, the United States, is not participating. China is the largest, as I recall, as far as leaving a carbon footprint. What's the current status of that Paris Climate Change Agreement, and what can be done perhaps to get the United States back in or to strengthen it to where they move more quickly in dealing with this climate change disaster that's looming on the horizon?
Yeah, no, good question, and I think the urgency is the critical matter, not only is multilateral cooperation under some threat, but the willingness of governments to listen to scientists somehow or other also seems under threat, and the scientists are pretty much in unison that not only are human beings responsible for a lot of what we see at the moment, but that we're well short of our targets and not moving in a direction very quickly that will lead us to fulfill that 1.5 degrees Celsius goal. And so, you know, younger people are up in arms. There's a concern that too much of the climate change agenda is at the international level and too little is at the local level, where these changes can be made more quickly. We need more people in the game, and where we're going to get them is at local level. It's not at multilateral level. And so, yeah, so you have this perfect storm where you have governments pulling out of agreements, you have governments not taking the agreements they've signed seriously enough, you have governments seemingly trying to remind the UN of something it doesn't need to be reminded of, that they have the sovereign right to do what it is that they want to do, and you have still a relative neglect of local initiatives, of, you know, getting people on the ground to understand that they not only have concern but they have agency, and that agency is absolutely indispensable if we have any chance of getting to this 1.5 Celsius goal. And if we don't get there, you know, we, as the Secretary General's last two have said over and over again, I mean, we just don't, there's no plan B. There's no planet B, but there's also no plan B. We don't have options at this point.
It's very true. And you mentioned a very key term, sovereignty, and that is one of the critical terms that we have to think about, because every country is sovereign to a certain degree. But when you join an international organization, if you're part of the European Union or part of the UN agencies or any of the UN agencies, whatever, you don't subvert yourself to falling under the rule of those agencies, but you do give up a little bit of sovereignty in that you cooperate with other people, with other countries and that type of thing. And that seems to be lacking today, that we're moving back, instead of trying to solve these problems together, we're moving into a sort of an individualistic approach to dealing with climate change, which you can't do. It's absolutely impossible to deal with peace and security, climate change, Ebola outbreaks, whatever, by yourself.
Absolutely.
We have to do it together.
Climate, migration, pandemics. I mean, there's a whole range.
Exactly.
Food security. These are things where sovereignty is a highly limited construct in terms of, you know, how we proceed. Right. It just absolutely is. Yeah.
Yeah. Is there a discussion of that today at the UN? Do you hear much about it? I mean, every country values its sovereignty, obviously. Its ability to remain independent to some degree and make its own decisions.
Yeah, no, of course. And we it's a charter provision, we want it protected, et cetera, but the way in which we understand that notion evolves, right? It's like where the red lines are, you know, the lines shift all the time. And I think we're now in this period, we've talked about this a little before, about we're in this really thin-skinned period, both internationally and locally. And by thin skin, I mean, you know, that people we want to be able to do what it is that we want to do, but we want to do it without criticism and without consequence. And I think that's just, life doesn't work that way, you know? And you see this at the UN a fair amount, where you have governments, you know, coming to sit, whether it's UN Habitat or the World Health Organization or the Security Council even, you know, saying two things simultaneously. One of which is, you know, we need your support and we need your assistance and we need your technical assistance and we need your funding and we need your food aid and whatever, you know, and help with returning refugees, et cetera, but we don't want you in our internal affairs. Well, from where I sit, if you're doing the first set of those things, you're already involved in people's internal affairs, right? So it's a little bit, sometimes it's like a teenager that says, you know, give me my allowance and stay out of my bedroom kind of thing, you know? And it's just like, there has to be some way. It's not so much that support needs to be provisional, but it's like if you buy into one part of what the UN does and part of its value system, you have to buy into the other part of it, which is there are charter norms, there are norms that govern human rights, that govern protection of journalists, on and on and on, and these are things that need to be adhered to, or at least try to adhere to them, but not object to them as though they're sort of de facto interference in internal affairs. That just doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guests. We'd invite our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision.com to view previous programs. Also, if you're involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you'd like to share our programs, please do so. Global Connections Television is provided at no cost as a public service to help people better understand international issues and how they impact our lives. Today we're talking with Dr. Robert Zuber, and he is an expert on a wide range of issues from climate change to peace and security and a variety of others, and we're getting into all of them. Bob, you mentioned a minute ago the Security Council. And the Security Council is the most powerful organ of the 6 organs within the UN system. Give us a little overview of just a thumbnail sketch of what is the Security Council and how has that role evolved over the past 74 years, the life of the UN basically, and how can it be improved? What can it do in the future?
Yeah,
no small task.
No, it's maybe beyond my skill set. But thank you for the question, and bless you, by the way, for the public service that you provide here. This is great. This is really great. Yeah, well, the Security Council is our primary cover inside the UN, and we spend a fair amount of time providing feedback, some of which is actually acknowledged, much of it probably not. But it's a fascinating body for a number of reasons. One of which is that so much of the UN system is predicated on the Security Council doing its job. If you think about the number, for instance, of pledging conferences that we have at the UN and discussions about humanitarian access and how are we going to take care of people who have been victimized by conflict in one way or another, people who have had their hospitals and schools bombed, who have been raped by combatants, whatever the situation is. Well, you realize that how much of the energy of the UN is spent recovering from conflict, which it is the Security Council's job to prevent, and if not to prevent, to minimize, to bring to a conclusion as quickly as possible. I've been in the council chamber, for better or worse, for too long. I used to be young, but those days are long gone. And I don't know everything about what the council does and doesn't do. Obviously, I have no access to consultation rooms and things of that sort. But in the main, the council operates on the basis of provisional rules of procedure that need to be less provisional, I think, and looked at really carefully in terms of how often governments are allowed to speak. Why, for instance, do governments that are under scrutiny by the council get the last word in council meetings, which is never a good thing, and the kind of members, permanent members 5 and elected members 10, talking over and over and over again in their national capacity, when what we need them to be talking about is what they're doing as a council. What is the plan to get the council to do the job that it is mandated to do, and to make sure, in our view, that the elected members have an important role that is more than just working on sanctions committees and being kind of bullied around by the P5, but have a real say in terms of how the council is organized, what it does, etc. I think the non-permanent members, the elected members, elected is a better term, are really the key to Security Council reform. There is now an alumni in the building of governments that have served recently on the council as elected members, and those governments, together with the new permanent members, Germany, South Africa, Indonesia, Dominican Republic, and Belgium, that's a pretty formidable group. And the General Assembly is taking more responsibility for peace and security, and the Peace Building Commission has a higher profile, thank God, than it's had in the past. This is all really important stuff. So the Security Council has got to figure out a way, I think, to work and play better with other children, and to ensure somehow that its national interest does not impede the interest of the global system in in peace and security that would reduce the pressure on all of the other sectors of the UN, especially on the humanitarian sector. The pressure on them is just extraordinary, and it's all based on, in my view, aside from some climate events, which are also getting worse, the failure of the international community to address peace and security at early enough stages.
Now, you mentioned the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council: the United States, Russia, the United Kingdom, France
and China.
Yep. And of course, they're on permanently. They're there ad infinitum. But they do have the excuse me, they have the right to veto a resolution. And theoretically, any resolution that the Security Council adopts is not vetoed, or that does pass the Council, is binding on the member states. But if we look at the Security Council, their agenda has changed. It's broadened, it seems to me. You mentioned climate change. Years ago, climate change would never have been discussed at the Security Council. But today, the Dominican Republic, which is chairing the Security Council this month, brought that front and center.
Yes, they did.
And that tells us that climate change has finally made the big time. People are taking it seriously, and they realize that it contributes to a breakdown of peace and security.
Yeah, no, for sure. And the same is true with migration. There are many peace and security threats that the Security Council has been, in some instances, slow to adopt. There's a whole, we could do an entire show on thematic obligations of the Council and how they differ from country-specific obligations, and they do differ. For one reason, that the thematic obligations are also binding on the P5, and it's not always clear that the country-specific obligations are binding on the P5. But nevertheless, there's a broadened understanding of peace and security triggers. Uzbekistan, this wasn't in the Security, well, it was actually in part in the Security Council. The president came to New York to do some briefings about the Aral Sea, which was once the 4th largest body of water, fresh body of water on the planet, and now is a trickle. And now, we have to think about, okay, what do we do with these people? How do we help restore their livelihoods? How do we ensure food security and water security? And, sitting there watching this, my only thought was, we should have been having this conversation 10 years ago. Like, this is in some ways too late in the game. And part of what urgency requires of a system like this is that we get out in front of things, that we do better risk assessment, but that we also hold people accountable to the risks that we're assessing. And this is an issue for the Security Council as well. I mean, you said their resolutions are binding, and they are according to the Charter, yes, they are legally binding. The question is whether they're enforceable. And for most people in most country contexts, a law that is not enforceable is not binding in any kind of meaningful sense. And if you look at the Council resolutions in terms of the effects that they've had in the world, most of them, and almost all of them in critical aspects, have been ignored or incompletely implemented, often to the detriment of the system, often to the detriment of the countries involved. But we have to recover a notion of binding that is really binding. And I think that the diminution of respect for multilateral institutions is that this notion of binding, it's more like, like we have in the Christian and Jewish traditions, the 10 Commandments. So this is more like the 10 suggestions, and people now are more willing to walk away from these suggestions, binding or not, than they used to be. And this is very dangerous for the system, I think.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are a myriad of issues being dealt with at the United Nations. As you look over the horizon, what do you see as the main issue the UN is going to be dealing with as we move further into the 21st century?
Well, I think two things. I mean, one is, is the UN has to demonstrate to people that it is an honest broker on the issues that it has already communicated urgency to the global public about, right? So if the oceans really are you know, if the pH is changing and the seawater is rising and the fish stocks are diminishing and the ocean has more plastic in it than it has fish, you know, is the UN the place to get movement on those things, an urgent movement on it, not just movement? And in the case of nuclear weapons, are we going to exist forever in this kind of two-tiered system where weapons are horribly dangerous in the hands of some, but are perfectly benign in the hands of others, which is the system we have now? In the case of climate, you know, can the UN be trusted, and can the member states, you know, the constituent parts of the UN, can it be trusted to move the international community to take this more seriously so that we can get to 1.5? And I think also in the case of, this was a question, I don't know if it's okay if I respond to it or not, but
we've got 15 seconds.
Okay, but I think we need to do much more on ensuring the safety of NGOs and journalists in the field. I mean, NGO life here is problematic at points, but this is easy duty for us, and we are tied to people in the field who are in great danger all the time, and the danger is increasing, and we need to put more energy in their direction.
Most assuredly. Dr. Robert Zuber, I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
My pleasure. Thanks,
you.
Bill. Always good to see you.
Good to see you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.